Today, I want to talk about kind of three things here. I want to talk about how, almost from a sociological perspective, Christianity shapes our worldview and our relationship around money. That's the first thing I want to talk about. The second thing I want to talk about is how that is harmful, how the Christian perspective of money is harmful. And then I want to talk about what we can do about that, how to heal from that. So those are kind of the three things that I want to get into today. First and foremost, I do want to make it clear that I don't think this pertains to every single Christian. I'm not trying to attack everyday Christians. It's not that I think that everyday Christians are inherently, contributing to a harmful dialogue about money, but I don't trust the pastors. I'm going to tell you that right now, who are asking us to tithe, who are asking congregation members to tithe. I think that's really sinister. And I'm not available for any excuses about but also this, and it's for the kingdom of heaven, yada, yada, yada. So we're going to dive into that and how that's just the beginning of how harmful the Christian worldview of money actually is. But I also want to get into not just about tithing, about how Christianity's perspective on money is so intertwined with its perspective on suffering. And that's where I think the harm is really manifest, is really evident. So what I did was I compiled a few TikToks for us because you guys know I love my TikToks. I think it's a great resource for connecting with people and learning about really interesting concepts such as the relationship between Christianity and money. I made this collection of TikTok videos public and I've linked it below if you're interested in doing your own deep dive into what these creators have to say, etc. Coming from the perspective of an ex-Christian, of an ex-evangelical fundamentalist Christian, I think that it's still something that's affecting me in my daily life. There's a lot of ways that I am trying to navigate my relationship with money in such a way that is not still a result of Christian indoctrination. And the reason I think it's so important is because on a macro scale, on a societal scale, I do think it affects how we not just vote in a political landscape, but it affects how we view people with different level of money as us, right? Different levels of money as us. So from a Christian worldview, your perspective of the poor and your perspective of the wealthy is very much shaped by your interpretation of biblical literature. Now, there's a couple ways to go about that. I will recognize there are a few Christians comparatively to the number of Christians as a whole. There are a few Christians who I would say are more in tune with a justice-focused perspective on money and wealth inequality. But somehow, and that's what I want to look at today, there has been this warped concept of how money works and how money should be divvied up and who deserves money in recent iterations of Christianity that has now overtaken the religion as a whole. And as you guys know, I often say, I think it's great, I think it's awesome and amazing that there are some progressive or justice-focused Christians who call themselves Christians but are truly on the side of liberation, and I stand by them in solidarity. However, unfortunately, I do challenge them to consider why they're aligned with a worldview that's predominantly focused on perpetuating inequality, wealth inequality. And that's not me coming at it just from a bitter ex-Christian perspective. Yeah, it has affected me in my personal life 100%. 100%. The way that money was taught to me from the biblical perspective totally messed me up. But also, there is verifiable evidence of how the Christian church has manipulated the conversation around money to control and profit from its congregation members. And that's what I kind of want to get into. So the very famous interview that is a great starting point, but that we're not actually going to watch because I'm going to get, a copyright mark if I do play it, is the Kenneth Copeland interview, in which he is confronted by an Inside Edition interviewer who asks him about his most recent, but not exclusive, purchase of a private jet. I think this was one of his many private jets. And he was asked about why he said previously before this interview that he doesn't want to fly commercially so that he's can avoid being thrown into a tube of demons being people who are flying commercially. And this conversation with the reporter confronting him about this concept is like very, very viral. You've probably seen clips of it. The reason I bring up the Kenneth Copeland interview, go watch it on your own time, is because I think it is such a clear picture of how these super wealthy religious leaders, these evangelical pastors, navigate these conversations and the framing of this conversation in such a way to convince the congregation members to contribute their wealth to this guy's wealth. Because it's not out of left field to call the evangelical Christian church in the United States essentially a pyramid scheme. And we're going to look at a video as to how that is an accurate description. But the point with that is the people at the bottom of the rung of this hierarchy are shelling out their hard-earned cash. I'm just really interested in and concerned about how these pastors are able to convince their congregation members that it's okay that they have private jets. I don't think that it's okay. I don't think there's any justification you can give me that makes it okay for a pastor to have that level of wealth. And I'm going to be so for real right now, and this might piss a lot of Christians off, but first and foremost, because I don't think pastors really contribute to the betterment of people. I don't think that they do. I don't think that bringing people to Jesus is a just cause. I think that is a harmful cause. Bringing people to believe that their salvation is fulfilled outside of themselves by some dead guy who lived a couple thousand years ago. Bringing people to believe that they have to listen to that pastor's interpretation of the Bible in order for them to have more prosperity in the future if they just believe enough. I'm actually not available for any justification for how a pastor has a private jet. There is none. There is none. And what's interesting is like when I bring that up, I'm going to get Christians who say, well, actually, according to this Bible verse, excuse me, using the Bible to prove the validity of the Bible, never going to work either. That is incredibly illogical. And anyone who has convinced you that reading the Bible to prove the validity of the Bible is a logical, sensible thing to do is trying to get something from you, and it's most likely money. So I'm just going to let that sit with you for a second. So I mentioned how the Christian worldview of money is tied to the Christian worldview of suffering, and I actually want to start with this YouTube video I found. I believe this guy is a Christian, like a very fundamentalist Christian, as in he takes biblical literature to literally be the true word of God. And I want to just kind of process the message he has on this video that got 100,000 views with you. I want to kind of react to it with you. So yeah, let's take a look at that. Oh my goddess.
This isn't just like a cute 3-point sermon. Like, these are biblical truths that we need to get into our hearts and minds. Suffering, number one, is to be expected. Just like the cross was expected, just like Jesus was fulfilling scripture, they should have known this was coming. He told them, your suffering, it's been predicted, like in numerous ways. First off, you're told to take up your cross and follow Jesus. A cross is a suffering type thing of the highest degree.
So yeah, already right out the gate, I just want to reiterate that he associated your perspective on how to move through this world, the Christian perspective of how to move through this world, relates to suffering. And just like a side note, setting aside the conversation about money just for a second, the Christian worldview of suffering is so barbaric and it is so debilitating for people whose material conditions are not serving them. And yet, the way that the Christian worldview frames suffering eases the burden of these people who are struggling in the material world by promising them something better, either in the next life or later in this life, as long as they just believe and guess what? Give to the church so that they can invest in the kingdom of God, which can then return on its investment. Okay? I am not available for any ifs, ands, or buts about how, but this, but also one time I tithed to the church and then I got a check in the mail. I'm not interested in these exceptions that make the rule, okay? Because when you have 100 people giving 10% of their income for the hope that their suffering will be eased, and only 2 of them then see a return on that investment, I care more about the 98 people, to be completely honest. So again, moving the concept of suffering aside from the conversation about money for just a second, keeping people in this really dark perspective of life on earth sucks. Life on earth is hard. Life on earth is equated to suffering. It is intertwined with suffering. You are expected to suffer. You are expected to be a servant and have a servant's heart. I remember hearing about all of this growing up all the time. If you're not having a hard time, you're not being challenged by God enough. And it's just it's also so hypocritical, because then once you get to a certain level of wealth, even in the Christian worldview and the Christian perspective, it's because you suffered enough. And I just don't understand why people are just okay with being told, like, hey, you have to suffer. And I say that, but like, I understand that part of it is like, we are suffering under this system that is not designed for us. And when we are suffering like that, we are looking for any ways of justifying why that is. And one of the easiest ways that we have been programmed to understand why suffering exists, especially under Western capitalism, is by blaming it on ourselves. And so there's a lot of conversation in the political world and the economic world. There's a lot of conversation about capitalism versus socialism, or capitalism versus communism. And everyone has their perspectives on which economic model serves the most people, makes the most sense, is the most logical, yada, yada, yada. But what I don't think enough people are connecting there is how the Christian church in the United States, whether or not you think you're a capitalist or not, is upholding capitalism, period. Full stop. That's it. There's no way around that. It's not and honestly, what I just said has actually nothing to do with the Bible. Christian leaders don't need the Bible to prop up how capitalism serves them as religious leaders. But using the Bible to continue justifying their pyramid scheme of tithing and offering and giving the wealthy religious leaders even more money, using the Bible to justify all of that only, guess what, makes them richer. So let's keep watching. The reason I pulled up this video is because it's literally making the point that I'm trying to make about how Christianity relies on people wanting to have their suffering have meaning and purpose. Christianity relies on people suffering, and it requires them to blame themselves for it, or justify it in some way, or give it a grand, divine design purpose, so that they don't actually work together to change the nature of the system in the first place.
It was like there was no example Jesus could have picked in the first century that was a greater illustration of suffering than the cross. There just wasn't one. It was called the extreme penalty, like the ultimate penalty by the people back in the time. You're also told that persecution is something you're going to endure. 2 Timothy 3:12, all who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. So you'll suffer persecution. And I think that in the season that's coming our way in our world, that persecution is going to increase. And this isn't to make us paranoid or make us think that everything's persecution when it's not. But yeah, it's probably increasing.
Okay, that's another point that doesn't really have to do with money, but I do want to talk about it for a second. This video was published a year ago, for context. The concept of Christian persecution in a country that is predominantly via a large majority Christian is one of the most brilliant tactics of people in power that I have ever seen. To convince the dominant belief group that they are being persecuted is the most vile and sinister plan to get people. At this point, I don't even know what their purpose is. Sometimes I'm like, we have seen so much evidence of how destructive the way things are going is and we just don't fucking learn. Like, it shakes me to my core. The concept of people who are part of the dominant group being persecuted is just, that's crazy. That this guy is talking about being persecuted as a Christian. And the other component of that is particularly harmful is how, like in academia, in a scholarly world, okay, part of the growth of our ideas and our understanding of the world, the natural world, the social world, all of it, is through challenging our own beliefs and having the inclusion of multiple perspectives. That's why in academia, the way it's supposed to work, I know it's not perfect. You guys have heard me talk about, call out the hypocrisy of academia in other ways, and historically speaking, you've heard me say that. But the way that academia is supposed to work is you don't get to just write an article and say, hey, I'm brilliant, right? Everyone needs to take this as if it's perfectly accurate and true. The nature of academia is peer-reviewed studies. And that is, other experts in your field have to sign off on the validity of your work in order for it to be credible, to be taken seriously. The nature of the way that this creator is talking about persecution is suggesting that when somebody challenges the validity of the Christian worldview, or saying, hey, I don't think the Bible is an accurate source to tell us how to live our life in the present, that will be considered persecution. Because and this is not me trying to be mean about Christians. This is coming from a firsthand experience as someone who was raised in the Christian church. When somebody confronts you about the validity of the Bible as the ultimate word of God, which, what the fuck are we doing? It is 2025. How can we still believe that? But for someone to question you about that, it is framed as persecution.
We need to set our face like flint. Be ready to face it. It's coming. But then there's another aspect of our suffering, and that is groanings. And for this, I want to give you a scripture because I think some of the prosperity preaching that we've heard has really damaged our ability to understand this. And then it messes us up, creates false expectations. But in Romans 8, I won't read through the whole thing, but in Romans 8, Paul talks about how creation is groaning. It's going through groanings. And so it's in slavery to corruption, creation itself. And what he seems to be talking about in Romans 8 is things like tornadoes and hurricanes and animal suffering and animal pain and forest fires and those kinds of things, earthquakes, this sort of stuff that's like the suffering of creation, where the world's beautiful, but things aren't right. Things aren't quite right. Then, so this is not things like where you sinned and you deserve this. It's just stuff that happens that's part of the overall plan of God's redemption. He allows this temporary time of pain and suffering.
Well,
then he says this. After creation...
That's convenient. That's a really convenient explanation as to why suffering exists. Like, a part of me still does have the empathy for people who cling to this one book. Like, even the nature of sin, which a lot of Christians will cling to as the reasoning for why bad things happen. And if it doesn't happen to them directly, like in the sense of I sinned so I deserve this, there's a macro scale of, well, sin in the world exists, sin exists, and so that's why bad things happen, like even natural disasters. And it's just like, it just goes back to being convinced that we're all inherently evil and like broken and need saved. So it just like kind of breaks my heart. I'm done with this guy's take, but you get where I'm at with this, is like, this is the Christian perspective, not just of suffering, but also how we should handle our money. It does go hand in hand, because unfortunately in a material world in which money does lead to our food and shelter and clothing, if we are suffering, money can really help a lot of it. And if we don't have money, it can be a lot easier to go through suffering. Okay, so unfortunately, in a world that does have real life consequences, money does have part of the conversation surrounding suffering. And so this is a great example of what I mean by the harm that a Christian worldview can lead to. And so now I want to get into more of the historical background as to how the Christian perspective on money in the modern world came to be and how it's harmful. And then after that, we'll kind of get into what we can do about it, where we're at. Okay, let's start here.
A lot of you have asked me about my religious background, which is quite nuanced because I did grow up in the Middle East. I have a lot of Muslim and Jewish friends, a lot of Buddhist friends, Hindu friends, but my dad was a Catholic and my mom is a Lutheran. And this reminded me of something that I wrote about years ago, which is the relationship between the rise of Protestantism in Northern Europe, specifically Northern Germany, and the rise of capitalism. Now, many of you are going to be like, oh, Leonie, that's a long shot, but once I explain it to you, it actually does start to make sense. So before the rise of Protestantism, it was actually very, very normal. So sins were directly tied to the church. You could literally buy your way into salvation, buy your way out of sins to go into heaven. Wealth was never seen as something inherently bad by the Catholic Church. Actually, on the contrary, because the church knew if their people were rich, this money would some way, or well, in one form or another, would end up with the Catholic Church, which would allow them to commission art, build cathedrals, which is why the Catholic Church has some of the most beautiful art, music, and cathedrals in the world. But Protestant reformers such as Luther or Calvin actually believed that work was a form to gain salvation. You work so you get closer to God. And spending lavish amounts of money on anything fancy, on like yourself, on your family for fun, was seen as a sin. So these people would work and work and work more to gain salvation and be favored from God. They would earn more money, but what do you do with that money if you can't put it into the church? If your church also tells you you can't use that money for any luxuries, it's seen as sinful and it's seen as wasteful. But also hoarding money was also not very much favored. So what do you do with it? That's right, you invest it, and you invest it into your own business. This whole shift created a completely new mindset on discipline, productivity, and reinvestment. As a result of this, many historians actually argue that with the reform of the church, with the rise of Protestantism, actually came the start of modern capitalism as we know it today. If you've ever been to a Protestant, a Lutheran, or Calvinist church, you can clearly see that there's a very stark difference between those churches and the Catholic churches. The Catholic churches are full of gold, full of ornaments. They're very luscious. They're very rich in what they're giving us. We go into this Catholic church and you can really see the richness of the Catholic church. Whereas if you go into a Protestant church, there's none of that there. And the Protestant church actually also did this because they believed that all of these like ornaments, all of these things, material things, would distract you from your actual faith. What I find incredibly exciting about this is that you can still feel the roots of these theological debates in our society today because they have shaped the way that we see discipline, the way that we see wealth, the way that we invest, maybe don't invest. So I just find that very exciting, and I hope you did too.
Okay, so that I think is super interesting. It does kind of get into Max Weber's Protestant work ethic, which we've covered on this platform before. So I kind of just wanted to give like a little bit of contextual background there and then jump into a couple other videos. Again, a lot of this we've talked about on this platform before, but I just kind of wanted to bring it all together and reiterate some of the harm that this perspective does, not just on a societal level, but like on an individual level. And it's something that I've really been trying to navigate in my own life, and how the Christian perspective I grew up with is holding me back financially, because I do think that there is a very significant emotional and mental component to our relationship with money that was kind of hijacked by these beliefs we were taught. And so I'm trying to learn how to heal a lot of that and regroup and reevaluate how I want to view money. And this is just part of the conversation, and I want to be able to help all of us in learning that together. So yeah, okay, so let's keep watching. Okay, then I wanted to do this one because it's kind of like a nice follow-up from that video we just watched.
Absolutely.
If you can't see the comment here, you can see, but Protestants really took Catholicism's "you are fundamentally unworthy" and just tacked on "because you aren't working hard enough." That is a crazy comment. That when I first saw this video and I saw that comment, I was like, yeah, that unlocked a whole new level of understanding, because as I was talking a little bit ago, like the fundamentally unworthy narrative that religion tries to plant into our subconscious so that we're constantly trying to find ways to be enough, to be okay, to be saved, whatever it may be, is like, it is totally hijacked by the idea of if you work hard enough, then you'll be okay kind of shit. So yeah, I think this is a really interesting perspective here.
And since so many people in that video's comments questioned whether what I was talking about was about actually Protestantism as a whole going back to the Protestant Reformation or not, or whether I was taking modern prosperity gospel and attempting to spread it too broadly across Protestantism, this time we spent a little bit of time talking about Martin Luther and John Calvin. And yes, a lot of what I'm about to say comes out of books written by people like Max Weber, W-E-B-E-R, right? But anyway, Martin Luther, John Calvin, two of the biggest figures in the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther, he of the 95 Thesis nailed to the door of the church. John Calvin of predestination theology. Martin Luther was a monk, had this real strong idea about the idea that God put you in your place in social hierarchy and gave you your work from birth, sort of, and then it was your duty to God to do that job. Some of his gripes with the Catholic Church started in that monastery, where he started to see that he thought some of the contemplative aspects of the monastic life were being lazy, and that manual labor was superior to it. So we're starting on the labor thing. But importantly, Martin Luther did not actually himself believe in the idea that making money from money was good because it wasn't labor. So this is where we get the Protestant work ethic being about actually work first, and some of the other stuff comes in later. Calvin believed God had already picked whoever's going to heaven, and you can't really do much about it. But you might find out whether you are somebody who God picked by living your life really well, and that included how well you worked. Success in worldly endeavors was a sign that you were one of God's elect. If you were instead indifferent and displayed idleness, that was a pretty good indicator you were not one of the elect. Calvin is big on the idea that all men must work, even the rich, because work is the will of God. And men weren't, and of course we're talking about men because it's when it was. Men were not supposed to look for easy living and wealth. They were supposed to reinvest the profits of their labor into financing further ventures. Beginning of capitalism. Calvin further went on to say that the using of profits to help others rise from their lesser level of subsistence violated God's will, since persons could only demonstrate they were part of the elect by their own labor. Sound familiar? This stuff is what laid the groundwork for all of what came after and turned into the Protestant work ethic and the Protestant push for being behind capitalism. I grew up Christian Reformed, which is a Calvinist denomination of Protestantism, at least for my youth. At age 9, I was memorizing the Catechism, which starts, "How do you come to know your misery?"
So I think what's important about that video is how very much intertwined the history of capitalist belief and Christian belief are intertwined. And I understand that it's only a specific denomination. We were talking about Calvinism and Lutheranism specifically. Like, a lot of Christians like to say, well, that's not what I believe. That's not what I believe. And it's like, okay, but that's actually my point, is we're talking about an entire belief system called Christianity that has been used to manipulate worldviews in specific ways to justify, guess what? Capitalism. And so I think a lot of, especially Americans who were not raised in the Christian church, I think it might be really interesting for them to consider how deep their understanding of capitalism has been affected by the Christian church nonetheless. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Why do Americans hate the poor? So here we have somebody judging a homeless person for how they use their money. And it's thanks to the Protestant Reformation that we perceive poverty as a moral failing. In the 1500s, Europe's population was booming, and all sorts of new revenue streams were coming in thanks to the age of exploration. So the newly wealthy Protestants' prosperity was linked to a certain religiosity. They deserved what they got from God. And so the poor also deserved what they got. It was because of some sort of inherent failing. The Puritans certainly brought that belief that poverty was a failing to the United States. And it's really deep-seated in the American consciousness that poverty is not something that has to do with failures of the state, but instead something that is inherently wrong with the poor, which is, of course, patently false.
I think that's a great video that kind of, again, talks about how much religion has shaped our perspective on how we view poor people. And this is certainly coming from my own experience, like having to deconstruct and re-examine why I have certain beliefs about poverty itself. There is that systemic lens of how we need to be rethinking poverty and how we need to be thinking of how the government should or shouldn't help, people who it abandoned to poverty, if that makes sense. But on a personal level, for us here who are kind of healing our relationship with money, I have had to kind of come to terms with how essentially the material conditions that I've been in, first of all, is comparatively so much more privileged than so much of the rest of the world. But second of all, not a direct reflection of my value as a person. And that's something that has really allowed me to kind of unlock how I see moving through my finances and my relationship with money. Once I finally let go of the concept of how much money I had being directly tied to my value as a person, it actually stopped bringing so much stress to me. And I think that's a big part of this conversation. I don't stress about money nearly as much as I used to when I considered my financial situation as a direct representation of my value, right? And that's what Western capitalism wants us to see ourselves as, is a direct correlation with how valuable we are to society. But I learned that that stresses me out because I don't have the most money in the world. And so how can I be the best version of myself? When in reality, when I let go of a lot of that stress about how I am or am not valuable to society, I let go of a lot of that stress, and I've been so much more involved in my friends' lives. I've been so much more available to not just be supportive of my friends and family, but also to invest financially in their birthday parties and, buying them meals here and there. I don't know what it is, but something about releasing a lot of, I guess, the shame around not having enough money to be considered a good person in my own Christian indoctrinated perspective. It allowed me to show up for people and have a generous spirit, which is really, really important to me, as long as, of course, I'm not, being generous to, a church for the sake of hopefully getting something out of it, either in this life or the next. To me, that's not a spirit of generosity. That's a spirit of desperation. And so it's just been a really interesting path, deconstructing from my relationship with money according to my evangelical Christian upbringing. And I kind of want to show a little bit more about now how mega churches get so much money, because some of the more historical background about how Calvinism and Martin Luther kind of set up Christianity to go hand in hand with capitalism can kind of just be very vague and abstract. But when we actually look at the real world applications of how mega churches get so much money, I think it does paint a clearer picture as to how all of this historical background and theology and worldview is set up so that a few people can make bank. So let's take a look at that.
Have you ever wondered how conservative megachurches get so much money? Yeah, there's one hidden little trick that they do that blow your mind. Hi, I'm Jeremy. I'm a deep skeptic, also a pastor. So I actually used to work at a megachurch, don't anymore, really not a fan. And the whole process of getting tons of money for some of these megachurches starts right at the beginning. The trick isn't until the end, but the beginning is important. And it begins with hype and friendship. You walk in the door, there's high fives, there's really horribly extroverted people that are shaking people's hands, that are out in front, that are doing their best to make friends with you. And then you take your kids go to a place where there are inflatables and the teenagers have video games. It is like this epic, amazing first experience. It's like you're getting to go to this place where everybody loves you and wants to be your friend, and all of the people are having so much fun. And unless you show up on the one like we hate gay people sermon that happens every year, you are like, wow, this is pretty good, and the band is really good, and there's lasers, and I didn't know that lasers were part of church. And then at the end of that first visit, likely in the worship service, they say, hey, we've got a class for people who want to learn more about our church and you should come to it. And you probably don't sign on the line for that time, but it's logged in your head. And then afterwards, there's follow-up. There's a text message. There might be somebody who leaves a gift, maybe even a fresh baked thing on your doorstep. And hopefully the pastor doesn't just show up unannounced, but sometimes that happens if they're old school. But the idea is you showed up and all of these people really like you and really want to be your friend. And let's be clear, like I said before, there are some extremely extroverted people there that I think authentically really would like to be every person's friend there. They'd like to be every person's friend in the whole world. And then you go again, and they really lean into getting you to go to that membership class. You go to the membership class. Actually, I wrote one of those curriculums for one of these churches. And the class is full of love and all of the good things. And they most likely don't even mention the fact that they hate gay people. One of the things in the membership class is money. They tell you this lie that the Bible tells you that you should give 10% of your income to the church. And if you want to be a member, that's an important part of it. That's an expectation that you would give like 10% of your income to the church, or more if you want to. Everybody's okay with more. And the person teaching that part of the class will likely say they give 10% of their income to the church. They're on staff and they do that. What they don't tell you is that they were required to do so, sometimes in writing, but always in the employment paperwork there is an auto draft. Which brings us to the trick. You've now spent several weeks in study, you've had lots of people trying to be your friend and probably inviting you to lunch or dinner or whatever, and it's time for you to go and meet with a staff person to talk about membership because you're going to join the church. And they tell you a strange thing maybe to you. They ask you to bring your pay stub. Because as part of that membership process, before you actually go and join the church in front of everybody, they're going to look at your pay stub. They're going to calculate 10%. They're going to give you a bank draft form that will automatically deposit 10% of your income into the church's bank account. Automatically. Because they say the Bible says that the tithe is required, and the Bible doesn't say that. I've got a video on it. But here's the thing, the membership, the belonging to this group that has lasers and good bands, and your kids love it and your teenagers love it. The requirement for belonging is an automatic bank draft. If you say no, you can't join. You're not a member. That's the trick. Not a trick as much as a manipulation. Not as much of a manipulation as like stealing money from people. But there it is. That's the trick. That's how they get their money. Now, not all of them do, but if you've ever find a poor megachurch, it's because they're not doing this trick.
Well, that's delightful. I have heard of that happening. I was never like a full-fledged adult in my megachurch, but I would not be surprised if that happened in the megachurch I grew up in. But I do know that membership requires a monthly tithing or offering. I also know that the private school that I went to, there were discounts for tuition if you were a verified tithing and offering giver. So there are, at the very least, very verifiable and real perks of giving tithe and offering to the megachurch. So it is very much crazy. Okay, let's keep going. I have one more about Protestant work ethic and that history.
So I've fallen down another rabbit hole, and now I can confidently say when and why work became so awful. So I post a lot of pro-worker content, and I started to see a bit of a theme in the comments, and it just made me wonder why people feel the need to insult you based on your job and constantly remind you that they are working harder than you, therefore better than you. So really, this all stems from the Protestant work ethic and how warped it became after the Industrial Revolution. So essentially, this stemmed from the belief that what was in the afterlife was worth suffering for in this life, which is why people were willing to work so hard. Now, where this all goes wrong is in the Industrial Revolution, because prior to that, workers and capitalists were not all that far removed from one another. So when workers put in extra effort and more hours, they were rewarded with more money. The Industrial Revolution is where this separation started happening, and all of a sudden capitalists realized that if they didn't treat their workers fairly, it meant more profits for them. So now we have this very dangerous combination of workers feeling the need to work as hard as humanly possible to prove their faith and to prove their worth. And that's combined with capitalists who realize that they've hit the jackpot because workers are doing all of this and they didn't have to reward them at all. And this is why you end up seeing people who are in the working class also being exploited, going after other members of the working class. And I realize what kind of comments I have opened myself up for on this video, but if it helps at least one person realize that they don't need to work that hard and it's okay to enjoy your life more than work, it was worth it.
That like hits really close to home because as a lot of you know, I can be kind of I can kind of like fall into the grind a little bit. I'm doing a lot right now with being in school full time and doing this full time and doing everything else full time. Oh my goddess. But I think that this is an interesting component to this conversation because it's about labor and how like it's crazy to me how capitalism relies on its labor force to indoctrinate itself to believe that if they work harder, life will be better for them, and how that is propped up and perpetuated by Christianity. And not just in talking about tithing and offering, but also, as I kind of hinted at earlier, this idea of a servant's heart. Servitude and submission to authority are all throughout the Bible, And it is literally a textbook on how to follow people who are making decisions about how you're going to get paid or whether you're going to get paid or whatever. And that's like a really deep level of indoctrination that even I still have a hard time letting go of because I do work my ass off, and I know a lot of us do, and it's because we're trying to not even just get ahead, but to keep the fuck up, okay? And it's like, that's why I wanted to make this video about trying to heal our relationship with how we view labor and money, because it's a total lie that we have to work hard to enjoy our lives. Like, I'm not a financial expert, and I'm not trying to give advice here, but it's just a matter of what are the ways that our beliefs are serving people who are significantly wealthier than us, and how can we dismantle those subconscious beliefs in order to actually live our best lives without living in such a way to serve their best lives. That's all I'm trying to get at here. And unfortunately, I think that Christianity and the messages that preachers present every Sunday is the mechanism through which a lot of us are holding ourselves back. Even if we're not in the church anymore, it's still like pervading on a cultural level. So I think that's really important context. I guess my answer to the question about how to navigate a world that relies on money for survival just has to do with us continuing to question our own beliefs about money and who those beliefs serve. Okay, because if I'm out here suggesting that hard work makes us better people, but there are people who literally can't work hard because of, I don't know, a disability or something. I think that perspective is serving not everyone, but just the people who are already in power and who profit off of our labor, right? But then also relying on having an abundance mindset in order to meet our financial needs, our material needs, that belief also isn't serving everyone, because it does logically end up with us looking at people in poverty and saying, well, why can't you just be grateful for what you have? And that's just so fucked up, right? Like, really what it gets down to for me is we will not know what it's like to have a healthy relationship with money until we're not relying on money for survival. And with that, I just want to challenge us all to constantly be questioning and using our critical thinking and thinking critically about how money moves through this world, what it means to want to live in quote unquote financial freedom. Like, does that freedom come at the expense of someone else's freedom? Like, it's not as easy for me to just say. It's almost like the Christian perspective on money is so easy. It's just like, work hard and God will reward you. Tithe and God will reward you. Like, that's easy. The reality is a lot more complex. And I'm just asking us to have a little bit more room for nuance, because that's how we can kind of deprogram ourselves from this level of indoctrination. And that's what I would like to see for us all to do.